November 1st, 1938, Pimlico Racecourse, Baltimore, Maryland. 5-year-old Seabiscuit stood at the starting line, preparing to race 1 3/16 miles against War Admiral, the 1937 Triple Crown winner who'd been named Horse of the Year over Seabiscuit, despite Seabiscuit earning more prize money. 40,000 fans packed Pimlico Racecourse, lining the grandstands, infield, and every available space. 40 million more Americans, 1 in every 4 people in the country, listened on radios across the nation. President Franklin D. Roosevelt paused a cabinet meeting to tune in. Cars stopped on highways as drivers pulled over to listen. The largest radio audience in history was about to witness what was being called the match race of the century. War Admiral was made the 1-4 favorite by bookmakers. He was the son of Man o' War, considered the greatest racehorse of the 20th century. He'd won the Triple Crown in dominant fashion just 18 months earlier. He was fast from the gate, sleek and powerful, with the glistening muscles of a warrior. He'd won 18 of his 22 career races. His owner, Samuel Riddle, had reluctantly agreed to the match race after months of pressure, believing his aristocratic champion shouldn't have to demean himself by racing against a Western upstart. Seabiscuit was everything War Admiral wasn't. He was small, just 15.2 hands high, undersized even by thoroughbred standards. He was low-slung with knobby knees and an awkward loping gallop that looked nothing like the fluid stride of champions. He'd lost his first 17 races. He slept far longer than other horses, sometimes 12 hours a day, and had a tendency to overeat. His trainer, Tom Smith, had called him lazy. Early in his career, Seabiscuit had been so unimpressive that his original trainers had used him as a training partner for better horses, deliberately letting him lose to build those horses' confidence. But as the bell rang at 4:20 p.m. Eastern Time, something shocking happened. Seabiscuit bolted from the starting line like a shot, taking the lead immediately. War Admiral, the speed horse who always led from the gate, was behind. The plan that trainer Tom Smith had secretly prepared for weeks was working perfectly. Within 2 minutes, Seabiscuit would win by 4 lengths, breaking the track record and completing one of the greatest upsets in sports history. A victory that would make him the 1938 Horse of the Year and transform him into a symbol of hope for Depression-era America. This is the story of how a stubborn colt who lost his first 17 races became the highest-earning thoroughbred of his era. How a car dealership owner from California challenged the Eastern racing establishment's supremacy. How a half-blind jockey and a quiet trainer transformed an underdog into a champion. And why November 1st, 1938 remains the most culturally significant horse race in American history, 86 years later. Seabiscuit was foaled at May 23, 1933, at the Wheatley Stable in Kentucky, one of the most prestigious thoroughbred breeding farms in America. His sire was Hardtack, whose father was Man o' War, the legendary champion who'd won 20 of 21 career races and was considered the greatest racehorse in American history. His dam was Swing On, a mare from solid bloodlines. On paper, Seabiscuit had the pedigree to be a champion. But from birth, Seabiscuit showed little interest in racing. He was stubborn, lazy, uncooperative. Where other young horses were eager to run, Seabiscuit preferred to eat and sleep. He had a voracious appetite, eating everything in sight, gaining weight that made him look chunky rather than athletic. His conformation was poor. He was too small, his legs were crooked, his gait was awkward. Veteran horsemen who examined him shook their heads. This colt would never amount to anything. Seabiscuit's original owner was Gladys Mills Phipps, who'd inherited Wheatley Stable and had bred some of the finest thoroughbreds in America. But Phipps saw no future in Seabiscuit. In 1936, after Seabiscuit had lost his first 17 races and shown no improvement, Phipps sold him for $8,000 to Charles S. Howard, a California automobile dealer who'd made millions selling Buicks and wanted to break into thoroughbred racing. Charles Howard was born in 1877 in Georgia, grew up poor, and moved west to San Francisco in 1903 with 21 cents in his pocket.
He'd gotten a job repairing bicycles, then transitioned to automobiles when cars started appearing in California. In 1905, he opened the first Buick dealership west of the Mississippi. By the 1920s, Howard was a millionaire, one of the wealthiest men in California. But personal tragedy struck in 1926 when his 15-year-old son was killed in a car accident. The loss devastated his marriage, which ended in divorce in 1932. Howard remarried in 1932 to Marcella Zabala, a woman 25 years his junior, and together they discovered horse racing. They attended races in Tijuana, Mexico, fell in love with the sport, and decided to buy thoroughbreds. Howard wanted to prove that California racing could compete with the Eastern establishment, which had dominated American thoroughbred racing since the sport's beginnings. Eastern owners, trainers, and breeders looked down on Western racing as second-rate, unsophisticated, populated by inferior horses. Howard wanted to change that perception. When Howard purchased Seabiscuit in 1936, he hired Tom Smith as trainer. Smith was a near-silent cowboy from Colorado who'd spent years training horses in the West. Smith had almost a mystical understanding of horses, able to read their personalities and quirks in ways that more educated Eastern trainers couldn't match. When Smith first examined Seabiscuit at the auction barn, he saw something others had missed. The horse wasn't lazy, he was bored. He'd been overworked and underappreciated in his early racing career, run so often against better horses that he'd learned losing was acceptable. Smith believed Seabiscuit could be retrained, remotivated, transformed from a losing plotter into a winning champion. The jockey Howard and Smith chose for Seabiscuit was Red Pollard, a Canadian-born rider who'd grown up in poverty, boxed professionally to earn money, and lost sight in his right eye after taking a hard punch. He never told anyone about his blindness, knowing that revealing it would end his riding career. He compensated by turning his head constantly during races, using his good left eye to see horses approaching from his blind side. Pollard was intelligent, well-read despite limited formal education, and had a deep understanding of horses. He and Seabiscuit immediately formed a bond. Under Smith's training and Pollard's riding, Seabiscuit began winning in late 1936. He won 5 races in California. Then Smith took him on a nationwide campaign in 1937 to prove Western horses could compete anywhere. Seabiscuit traveled 8,000 miles that year, racing at tracks from California to Massachusetts, defeating Eastern champions in prestigious races.
Like the Brooklyn Handicap, Massachusetts Handicap, and Yonkers Handicap. He won 11 of 15 races in 1937, earning $168,580, more than any other horse that year. But despite being the top money winner, Seabiscuit didn't win Horse of the Year. That honor went to War Admiral, who'd won the Triple Crown in 1937. The decision infuriated Howard and Western racing fans, who felt Eastern bias had robbed Seabiscuit of recognition he deserved. The only way to settle the debate was a head-to-head match race. Who was better, the aristocratic Eastern Triple Crown winner or the scrappy Western People's Champion? War Admiral was foaled on May 2, 1934, at Samuel Riddle's faraway farm in Lexington, Kentucky. His sire was Man o' War, his dam was Brush Up. Riddle had owned Man o' War, who'd become legendary by winning 20 of 21 races in 1919-1920, losing only once to a horse named Upset in a race where Man o' War was caught in traffic and couldn't get clear running. After retiring Man o' War, Riddle bred him extensively, hoping to produce another champion. He bred Man o' War to Brush Up 6 times, producing 5 unremarkable fillies before finally getting a colt, War Admiral. From the beginning, War Admiral showed his father's brilliance. He was quick from the gate, had explosive speed, and possessed the same competitive fire that had made Man o' War unstoppable. In 1937, as a 3-year-old, War Admiral won the Kentucky Derby, Preakness Stakes, and Belmont Stakes, becoming the 4th Triple Crown winner in history. Sports writers compared him favorably to his father. Neville Dunn of the Lexington Herald wrote after the Derby, "A little brown horse that takes after his mammy in size, but runs like his daddy, charged to victory in the 63rd Kentucky Derby.
War Admiral won all 8 races he entered in 1937, was named Horse of the Year, and was being compared to the greatest horses in racing history. He seemed invincible. When sports writers and fans began calling for a match race between War Admiral and Seabiscuit, Riddle's response was dismissive. His aristocratic champion shouldn't have to prove himself against a Western horse that had lost his first 17 races and looked like a cheap plater. But public pressure mounted throughout 1938. Howard campaigned aggressively in newspapers, challenging Riddle to a match race. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt II, the young president of Pimlico Racecourse in Baltimore, saw an opportunity to host the biggest race in decades. He negotiated with both owners, offering a $15,000 winner-take-all purse, minimal conditions, and national publicity. After months of failed attempts to schedule the race, scratches due to track conditions, scheduling conflicts, and personal disputes between owners, Riddle finally agreed to November 1, 1938, at Pimlico. The build-up was unprecedented. Newspapers across America ran daily stories. Radio programs discussed the race constantly. Sports writers took sides, with Eastern writers almost unanimously picking War Admiral and Western writers backing Seabiscuit. Every writer for the daily racing form picked War Admiral. 95% of journalists believed the Eastern champion would win easily. San Francisco Chronicle columnist John Lardner wrote, "I am one of the narrow-minded group that has seen War Admiral run too often to concede Seabiscuit a chance for anything better than a seat in Congress this year." The betting public, however, saw things differently. While bookmakers made War Admiral the 1-4 favorite, everyday Americans wagered heavily on Seabiscuit. He was the underdog, the people's horse, the scrappy fighter who'd overcome early failures to become a champion. In 1938 America, still suffering through the Great Depression, with unemployment above 15% and millions of families struggling to survive, Seabiscuit represented hope. If a lazy horse who'd lost his first 17 races could become great, maybe ordinary Americans could overcome their circumstances too. There was another problem for Seabiscuit going into the race. Red Pollard was injured. In June 1938, Pollard had been working a training session on a young colt named Modern Youth when the horse spooked and threw him, shattering Pollard's leg. The injury seemed career-ending. Howard needed a replacement jockey. He hired George the Iceman, Woolf, a respected rider who was known for his cool demeanor under pressure and his ability to execute complex race strategies. Woolf and Tom Smith developed a secret plan for the Pimlico match. War Admiral was known for his explosive speed from the gate. In normal races, Seabiscuit would start slowly, settle in the middle of the pack, then make a late charge. But in a 2-horse match race, letting War Admiral take the early lead would be fatal. Once War Admiral got ahead, his speed would be impossible to overcome. Smith had to change Seabiscuit's running style completely. For weeks before the race, Smith trained Seabiscuit to bolt at the sound of a starting bell. Seabiscuit had always been a fair starter, but never a quick one. Smith worked with him daily, conditioning him to explode forward the instant he heard the bell, teaching him that the early lead was crucial. The training was done in secret. Riddle and War Admiral's team had no idea Smith was changing Seabiscuit's tactics. November 1, 1938, dawned cold and overcast in Baltimore. By early afternoon, 40,000 fans had packed Pimlico, filling every seat, standing in the infield, crowding the rails. Special trains had been run from across the country to bring fans to the race. Scalpers were getting premium prices for tickets. The atmosphere was electric, charged with anticipation and significance. This was more than a horse race. It was East versus West, aristocracy versus common man, establishment versus underdog. At 4:20 p.m. Eastern Time, Seabiscuit and War Admiral approached the starting line. There was no starting gate. Riddle had insisted the race be run with a traditional walk-up start because War Admiral had a history of misbehaving in starting gates. Seabiscuit wore saddlecloth number 2 and his familiar blinkers. War Admiral wore number 1. They walked slowly, turned, straightened themselves. The starter rang the bell. Both horses broke cleanly, but within 2 strides, Seabiscuit was ahead. Woolf had hustled him forward exactly as Smith planned. War Admiral and Charlie Kurtzinger were caught completely by surprise. War Admiral had never been behind early in a race. Kurtzinger tried to rate his horse, to settle him, and make a run, but Seabiscuit was pulling away. Down the backstretch, Seabiscuit held a length lead. War Admiral gradually closed the gap, pulling even at the top of the stretch. The two horses ran side by side, matching strides, neither giving ground. 40,000 fans were screaming. Radio announcer Clem McCarthy's voice was rising with excitement. Across America, 40 million people were pressed against radios, listening in stunned anticipation. Then George Woolf did something brilliant. Following advice Red Pollard had given him before the race, Woolf eased up on Seabiscuit slightly, letting War Admiral pull even and slightly ahead. The tactic allowed Seabiscuit to see his rival, to understand they were in a race, to tap into his competitive instincts. As War Admiral drew alongside, Woolf felt Seabiscuit respond, felt the horse dig deeper, find another gear. About 200 yards from the finish, Woolf asked Seabiscuit for his closing kick. The horse exploded forward, pulling away from War Admiral with stunning acceleration. The lead grew to 2 lengths, then 3, then 4. Seabiscuit crossed the finish line 4 lengths ahead of War Admiral, clocking 1 minute, 56 3/5 seconds, breaking the track record. The crowd erupted. Clem McCarthy's call became legendary. Seabiscuit by 3, Seabiscuit by 3, Seabiscuit is the winner by 4 lengths. The upset was complete. The lazy horse from California had beaten the Triple Crown champion convincingly. War Admiral's jockey Charlie Kurtzinger had no excuses. He just got beat by a better horse, Kurtzinger told reporters. Samuel Riddle, War Admiral's owner, was gracious in defeat. I still think my horse is the better one, but today Seabiscuit proved he's the better horse. Red Pollard, watching from the stands on crutches, his shattered leg still healing, was overcome with emotion. Seabiscuit did just what I thought he'd do, Pollard told reporters. He made a rear admiral out of War Admiral. The quote captured the victory's significance. The underdog had humbled the aristocrat. The people's champion had defeated the establishment's favorite. The victory made front-page news across America. The New York Times ran a story with the headline, "Seabiscuit defeats War Admiral in thriller." Sports Illustrated called it the race of the century. Even non-sports newspapers covered the story, recognizing its cultural significance. In Depression-era America, where millions were unemployed and struggling to survive, Seabiscuit's victory felt symbolic. The small, unlikely champion had defeated the aristocratic favorite through determination and heart. If Seabiscuit could do it, maybe ordinary Americans could overcome their circumstances too. Seabiscuit was immediately named the 1938 Horse of the Year, finally receiving the recognition he'd deserved the previous year. He'd proven himself against the best horse in America, on fair terms, in a race that left no doubt about his quality. War Admiral would race twice more, winning the Rhode Island Handicap later in 1938 and a race at Hialeah in February 1939, before an injury ended his career. He retired with a record of 21 wins in 26 starts and earnings of $273,240. He'd eventually be ranked the 13th greatest thoroughbred of the 20th century. But War Admiral's legacy would always be tied to his loss against Seabiscuit. The photo finish showing Seabiscuit 4 lengths ahead became one of sport's most iconic images. War Admiral had been a great champion, but he'd lost the race that mattered most. When he was inducted into the National Museum of Racing and Hall of Fame in 1958, he was inducted the same year as Seabiscuit, the two rivals forever linked in history. Seabiscuit raced 9 more times after the War Admiral victory. In 1939, during his lone start of the year, he was injured and seemed destined for retirement. Charles Howard even bred Seabiscuit to 7 mares in spring 1939, assuming his racing career was over. But the horse defied expectations once again. After months of rehabilitation, and with Red Pollard finally recovered from his shattered leg, Seabiscuit returned to racing in 1940. On March 2, 1940, at age 7, Seabiscuit won the Santa Anita Handicap, the race he'd lost twice before. The victory was emotional, a storybook ending to a remarkable career. Pollard, riding despite still having metal screws in his leg, brought Seabiscuit from behind to win in track record time. Howard announced Seabiscuit's retirement immediately after the race. The horse had earned $437,730 in his career, making him the highest-earning thoroughbred in history at that time. His record was 33 wins, 15 seconds, and 13 thirds in 89 starts. Seabiscuit retired to Howard's Ridgewood Ranch in Willits, California, where he was bred to mares and lived comfortably. He sired 108 foals, though none matched his racing achievements. On May 17, 1947, Seabiscuit suffered a heart attack and died at age 14. He was buried at Ridgewood Ranch in an unmarked grave to prevent fans from taking souvenirs. His death made national news, with obituaries appearing in major newspapers. The Los Angeles Times wrote, "The old warrior died as he had lived, quietly and with dignity." The cultural impact of Seabiscuit extended far beyond racing. In 1940, Seabiscuit was the second biggest newsmaker in America, ahead of President Franklin Roosevelt and trailing only Adolf Hitler. Newspapers had covered his races more extensively than political events. His story resonated with Depression-era Americans who saw their own struggles reflected in his unlikely rise from failure to champion. Author Laura Hillenbrand, who wrote Seabiscuit, An American Legend in 1999, explained the horse's significance. When Seabiscuit crossed the wire, it was pandemonium. For Americans, in that era, in that time, that the underdog won the race fair and square was everything. One American in every 4 was listening to that race on the radio. They could turn off the radio and feel better about themselves and their prospects in the world because that little horse pulled it off, and if he could do it, they could too. The 2003 film adaptation of Hillenbrand's book, starring Tobey Maguire, Jeff Bridges, and Chris Cooper, was nominated for 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. The film introduced Seabiscuit's story to a new generation, though it took dramatic liberties with the facts. The real story, however, needed no embellishment. A small, lazy horse who'd lost his first 17 races had become America's champion, defeating a Triple Crown champion in the most anticipated race of the decade. Charles Howard lived until 1950, never losing his passion for thoroughbred racing. Tom Smith trained horses until his death in 1957, always preferring the quiet company of horses to the attention of reporters. Red Pollard rode until 1955, his career outlasting his battered body's ability to heal from repeated injuries. George Woolf continued riding until 1946, when he died after falling from a horse during a race at Santa Anita, possibly due to a seizure or heart attack. He was 35 years old.
War Admiral stood at stud at Faraway Farm in Kentucky, siring many successful racehorses before dying in 1959 at age 25. His grave is at the Kentucky Horse Park, at the foot of his father, Man of War's statue. The inscription simply reads, War Admiral, 1934 to 1959, but every racing historian who visits thinks of November 1, 1938, when the aristocratic champion lost to a lazy horse from California. The Blood Horse magazine's ranking of the top 100 racehorses of the 20th century placed War Admiral at number 13 and Seabiscuit at number 25. The rankings reflected career accomplishments, but they missed the cultural significance. Seabiscuit's impact transcended statistics. He represented hope to millions of Americans during their darkest period. He proved that underdogs could win, that early failures didn't determine destiny, that heart and determination could overcome superior breeding and natural talent. The November 1, 1938 match race remains the most listened-to sports event in American radio history. 40 million listeners represented roughly 1/4 of America's population. No subsequent sporting event, including Super Bowls and World Series games, has matched that percentage. The race's significance extended beyond sports into politics and culture.
President Roosevelt's decision to pause a cabinet meeting to listen reflected how completely Seabiscuit had captured the nation's attention. Modern sports fans struggle to understand Seabiscuit's importance. Horse racing is no longer America's most popular sport. The cultural moment of the Depression is distant history. But in 1938, Seabiscuit mattered in ways that transcended entertainment. He gave Americans hope when hope was scarce. He proved that underdogs could win. He showed that being small, awkward, and unlikely didn't disqualify you from greatness. When Seabiscuit broke from the starting line on November 1, 1938, ahead of War Admiral, he wasn't just winning a horse race. He was completing a journey from failure to triumph that mirrored America's own struggle through the Depression. The lazy horse who'd lost his first 17 races, who slept too much and ate too much, who had knobby knees and an awkward gait, had become a champion. And in that victory, millions of Americans saw proof that they too could overcome circumstances, that early setbacks didn't define destiny, that with the right people believing in you and the right opportunities, anything was possible. That's why Seabiscuit's victory over War Admiral remains culturally significant 86 years later, because sometimes the greatest stories aren't about natural gifts or aristocratic breeding. They're about ordinary individuals who refuse to accept that being small, awkward, or unlikely means accepting defeat. And on November 1, 1938, in front of the largest radio audience in history, Seabiscuit proved that lesson in the most dramatic way imaginable.